And strictly speaking, the dude thing wasn't something I chose for myself. I have two daughters, and one of them's 20. She goes to Lewis and Clark, so I'm a little bit hip to your world, and she's just like a hippie waiting to happen, so she's flourishing at Lewis and Clark. But I found out when she was 17 that all her friends called me the dude behind my back, which, if you've ever seen The Big Lebowski, is kind of a dubious honor because the dude is kind of a middle-aged, pot-smoking, martini-swilling slacker, a white Russian slacker. And he's a little overweight. I'm only a few of those things. I'm not really very good at doing anything other than telling people what I'm working on and what I'm learning. I think a lot of people make the mistake. I'm really glad you didn't say I was an expert, because I don't think this Agile space, like a lot of things, doesn't lend itself to expertise. There are people that are deep practitioners, but as soon as you get good at something, there's the need to kind of start looking kind of beyond that. In fact, one of the talks I've been doing lately is by it's based on this crazy neuroscientist who practices what he calls possibilianism, which is, the art of what could happen. So my company is in Minneapolis, which is kind of like the West Coast kind of toned down a little bit. Minneapolis, we have a sweet community, Dev Jams in an old coffee shop, wine bar. This is what it looks like when someone cleans it up to make it really look nice for a picture. This is what it typically looks like. This is an open space session, so I'm glad I have this picture in here because otherwise I would forget to plug it. So forget the word open space and imagine you've gone to see some people speak. I feel like my job right now is to start the discussions for today, to maybe even challenge or upset a few people. And the open space is that thing that doesn't happen at a conference where you can go sit and ask your question, talk with other people, figure out who the practitioners are that have other stories to tell, good, bad, and ugly. That's what's happening here. This is a Dev Jam open space. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's a little bit of a marketplace, which are all the conversations that the Twin Cities community wants to have about what we're trying to do, what we're supposed to do, what is working, what's not working, what we're doing that we're not supposed to be doing that's actually working. So it's one of the best forums. Kind of started at a lot of these conferences because a lot of the people that organized the conferences were unconference organizers. They're trying to say, how do we create a space for people to talk? These are some of the companies we work with. Some of them have no constraints. Or I should say they have self-induced constraints. So maybe like some of the work we do with a company like Target. So right now we're working with Target, helping them rewrite a bunch of their store systems. Their web space is theirs to mess up. No one's telling them what they have to do. A lot of the problems Target has are what I would call self-induced constraints. People are saying, oh no, we can't do that. They're not thinking about the possibilities. Working with this company right below it is significant. Boston Scientific has almost every possible constraint you could imagine. One of the gigs we did with Boston Scientific had to do with introducing agile methods around pacing devices where the goal of the event was to try and reduce each pacing event by a certain number of microvolts so you could defer changing the device. There's no user stories there, or there are very few. If you write a story called "As the device, I need to keep pacing dude so he doesn't fall down," you're kind of an idiot. Solve a lot of those problems with math and science, and yet the product is used by someone. It's put in someone, but it's used by someone, and if you stop to understand that person's perspective, then you just build more features into the device. And so Boston Scientific is a place that I'm really proud to have worked because we took their device delivery from 18 months down to 6 weeks, 6 weeks soup to nuts. That's modeling systems, firmware, software, and verification testing. I told that to this person that I'll affectionately call the Scrum lawyer, and he told me that wasn't agile. And I thought, dude, go lay by your dish. That is a crazy statement. He should have gone, that's amazing that you're doing that at a medical device company while still producing all the documents that the FDA demands, because you don't get to hand in Post-it notes to the FDA. They reject those. The other thing that's interesting about a medical device company is you don't get to lie about testing. I cut my teeth writing a lot of assembly in C and C++ in the 90s, and for most of the people I worked with, it was a social norm to lie to each other about testing. So I would say, did you test that? And dude would go, oh yeah, dude, I tested that. And We looked each other in the eyes and we both knew we were lying, but it was okay. It was super. There was a lot of things we lied about, right? Yesterday I was at Walt Disney Corporation, which is an interesting place to work, because saying you're working for Disney is like saying I work for the United States. It's such a weirdly huge place. It's one of the biggest brands I've ever been around. They have a lot of focus on what they call the guest experience until you step into their software shops. And then somehow, which is really interesting because everyone at Disney, whether they work as someone in a hotel or someone in the IT space, is called a cast member. And they've all been out in these shops, and they tend to kind of forget about the guest experience and start talking about systems. And then people suffer because systems are primary instead of like products and people. This is building on my Dude's Law thing. You guys will appreciate this. Most people, places I go, they don't get this. So I was thinking about lots of people at these companies say, well, that's not how we do Agile. That's not how you're supposed to do Agile. Doing Agile, as soon as you hear that phrase, you should be suspect. I think there's an inverse relationship between the amount of times people say Agile every day and the amount of agility they really have. I wrote a book for the pragmatic programmers for a while that I turned into a video series, and one of the editors said, you know, I want you to take the word agile in chapter 5 and I want you to replace it with a very offensive word, and then I want you to read the book out loud to yourself. It was super embarrassing, and I realized I had prepended everything with agile. It was agile this, and when I stripped it out, I thought, there's some truth in there that I really do value. It's just I'm kind of getting lost in the language. And so I thought, there's other people that have these simple rules that guide them, like this rule. Like, no one really tends to question this rule. Does anybody not believe this is true? Right? And so most people at a bank go, what's that? It's an equation, dude. Why did you write an equation? Yeah, so you guys all know that as resistance goes up, if voltage remains constant, current goes down. Dude's Law works the same way. So when people are learning, they're asking, how do you do this? How do you write stories? How do you do planning? How do you do lean startup? Do. And they forget why they're doing it. And that happens when people are new. And when you're new, there's a cost to learning. You don't get as much done. But across time, if you're always talking about how to do this stuff, that's a bad tell. So it's sweet that you guys have a coaching group, because that's good for a coaching team to listen to. After a certain amount of months, why are people still stuck on the mechanics? One of my buddies right away told me that in my equation, how can equal 0. I said, dude, in my equation, when how equals 0, you get infinite value. And I thought, that also, while funny, is what I'm looking for. What's the least amount of process? So that, and you know, we do a lot of weird things in the basement of DevJam. We do things like dojos. They're called the DevJam Jam sessions. They're loosely based on Fight Club. No one hits each other. But the idea is to set up a forum where everybody is a speaker. Everybody's a presenter. Everyone's telling their stories. So we do a lot of things where someone gets up and they're the chief discussion starter, and that's followed by a fishbowl conversation that the audience controls, so the panel can't just ramble on. We give people like red and green Post-its, so when you get sick of what they're talking about, you just vote them down. Dude, move on. I can't hear you talk about that anymore. So what I want you to do with you guys is, before we kind of get into some of the topics for today, I want to do what the jazz community calls stepping out. So I want you to just take a second, turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself. You're going to do a little exercise with this person for the next 5 minutes, okay? I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. Okay, so the shift we want to make, the shift I want you guys take you guys on today is from thinking about just process to thinking about product. So let's think about music as a product. So you're sitting with someone. I want the two of you to spend a few minutes talking about whether you think this is a good song. Okay, I'll give you like about a minute to decide whether you think this is a good song. Okay, so let's see what you came up with. Now, this should have been pretty easy because specifications don't get any more clear than that. That is documentation that has been used for a long time. Who thinks it's a good song? Why do you think it's a good song?
Just a gut feeling.
It's a gut feeling, yeah.
A lot of harmonic richness.
Okay, what about other people? Who else thinks it's a good song? Anybody else? Why do you think it's a good song?
Pretty sure I've played it before.
Okay, what is it? Okay, so he knows the music, right? Yep. There's always one. Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about Bach is he started out on the organ, and he loved the organ. So what he did is he went forward and tortured every musician trying to get him to play the same range as an organ. So this is like the most range you can get out of a cello, but you still don't know if it's a good song because there are very few people that can look at that music and hear it. And even those people don't hear the performance. This is what it sounds like. It's kind of like one of the holy grails of cello world. I'm learning to play a cello. I play guitar, and I thought, I can play cello. It's got strings, right? My teacher told me you play the notes with your left hand, the music with your right hand. That's significantly more difficult. Okay, let's try a different one. How about this song? Not as clearly documented, right? I went and looked for documentation for this next song, and there isn't any that I could find anywhere. I'm sure someone has someone in some museum somewhere. If you saw documentation for it, it would look like this. Which still doesn't really tell you much, and it sounds like this. Because they didn't write anything down. This is their product, though. This is what they produced. I don't know if you guys know it,
When
but
I find myself in
the Beatles hated this album. They hated Let It Be because it was not at all what they wanted. They gave it to someone else to produce it, and it's hard to say it wasn't successful. But they hated it, so they later released something called Let It Be Naked, because that wasn't what they wanted. But there's no documentation. I'm trying to push you towards what you like about music is not the process or the documentation, it's the outcome, it's the product. You don't really know much about how it was produced at all. You judge it just based on your experience listening to it. So let's step into our world. How about this? This is a good software product? Someone the other day guessed what this code was, which I was blown away by. It's pretty famous. In fact, it's really famous. It has one of the most famous errors associated with it, which is error 1202. It was on this system that shut down. Do you know why it shut down when they were landing? Because Buzz Aldrin decided they should flip on all the information and send NASA everything. And then later, they were trying to figure out why the system shut down. They brought in one of the dudes that wrote the manual, and he said, "Didn't you read the manual?" Says, don't turn all this stuff on. But pretty impressive, like, shut down, save state, and reloaded. Okay, one more example. What about this one? And there's a hint in this one, so you should be able to figure out what it is with a little analysis. What's that? Someone said it. Okay, who are the closet birders in here? All right, some of you are lying, right? Apparently, over 1 billion downloads, over 200,000 years of Angry Birds has been played. Right? Why is that? Why is that? Why do people love Angry Birds? Is it because they have limited work in process limits or linear burn down? No, in fact, I think it was Paul Graham I read once said, if you get good at doing the process, you get good at the process. If you get good at producing product, you get good at producing product. And what's interesting to me is that there's still a lot of people that are very much focused on the process, as though the process is what you're trying to do. It's never been the case, from structured programming to the spiral methodology to the unified process to agile flavors 1, 2, and 3. It's the outcomes, it's the product and the outcomes you're looking for. So I called the talk after the honeymoon, but let's get you up to the honeymoon. Let's talk about what your courtship was like, what your honeymoon was like. So in the upper left-hand corner is a dojo, like your guys are talking about. Dojo, for people that don't know, we do these in the basement of DevJam for the local community to try and keep people's skills sharp. The way we do it is a very simple thing. We give a problem out, and what happens is 2 people get up and solve the problem, and then 2 more people get up and solve the problem or advance the problem. And sometimes we advance the problem, and other times we see the problem solved in multiple languages or multiple solutions. This guy on the left up here always ends up solving the problem faster than anyone else with a regular expression. It's like he's just regular expression boy. On the other side of it is that I go into companies that just have Scrum Master has turned into this ugly combination of like rugby and the martial arts. You know, I applaud the fact that you guys are thinking about coaching. I'm starting to kind of grow weary of some of the rigidity in the language in the Scrum community, because if you want to spread this stuff in an organization, and someone that doesn't know anything about the process but cares an enormous amount about the product, here's this sentence. Last week in the retrospect, the Scrum Master said that the work in process limits were too high. Therefore, the burn down chart didn't look good. So we're going to go forward and blah, 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 blah. And they don't know what you're talking about. And then it becomes your process. It's the IT group's process instead of it's a product delivery process. You go on a few dates, you get married, you get some gifts. Like, what did you get in your gifts? The worst one you can get is the Scrum butt test. There's a lot of good gifts you can get. There's a lot of really great tools. Just like in programming, there's a bunch of fantastic tools, and then there's some things to avoid. The Scrum butt test was cooked up by these dudes in Nokia that were very proud of what they had done. They had taken people that weren't delivering, and they started delivering. And then they created this set of rules when what they were trying to do was right. From a dude's law perspective, they were trying to say, let's foster success. They thought how they did it was messed up because they mandated it. They said, you're doing Scrum, but you're not doing this. And the rest of that sentence is, therefore, it's not going to work for you. It's very arrogant, in my opinion. It's very out of context coaching. It tells people what to do instead of examining what results they're getting from it. And then people end up with this oftentimes. This is what I hear. I say, someone says, oh yeah, we're doing Agile. I'm like, what's that like? Well, we have lots of Post-it notes. You know, and Post-it notes don't solve problems. You're going to see a lot of Post-it notes in my pictures because I think they're an easier way to start discussions. But you should know as we go forward that most places I work are larger companies with large initiatives with multiple teams interacting, and we don't use Post-it notes for everything. We use them as just like discussion starting tools. But it's interesting to me to hear people talk about scaling this Agile stuff. That's almost all of what I've done. Rarely what I do is go work with 6 guys who are greenfielding a website in Django with the one dude who knows everything. There's usually an enormous amount of constraints, and we're working inside the constraints, and I think of constraints in 3 buckets. Things that are very difficult to change, like geography. Things that you can change, but they're very difficult to change. They're kind of like Mostly Dead in The Princess Bride. You know, you got to get Max the miracle worker to help you. And then there's self-inflicted constraints. And if you start thinking about it that way, then you can challenge yourself to say, what could we do? And you go beyond just this Agile stuff. You start saying, okay, I understand the mechanics. Someone helped me learn the mechanics. We're trying the mechanics. How are they actually helping us? One of the things I thought when Ray was talking about their coaching group is what I've done with a lot of coaching groups is started saying, a group starts adopting Agile methods or lean thinking or lean tools. What are the outcomes they're looking for, and how do you measure those? So early on in a lot of the Agile space, people were really hesitant of that. Oh, you can't measure this stuff. That's crazy talk. You can't measure how much someone loves someone else. That's very difficult. But there are a lot of things you can measure in this space that you can learn from. And if you're out there telling people, it's going to be better, faster, cheaper. You're already preaching measurements. I think better, faster, cheaper is very dangerous language. You go into an ecosystem where people don't get along, they don't have good skills, they're programming in a swamp, and they don't really know what their product is, and you quickly find out they don't get along, they don't have good skills, they're programming in a swamp, and they don't know what their product is. The process is supposed to be the simple part that surfaces a lot of the hard issues, and a lot of those don't have tools. Some do. So let's talk about some of these. So who in here is at a stand-up every day? Keep your hand up for a second. Okay, keep your hand up if you feel like, man, if that went away, we would just fall apart. Okay, so that's not the stand-up's fault, and you guys should ask yourself, what are you trying to get out of it? I go to stand-up meetings where someone says, yesterday I was in meetings all day, today I was in meetings all day, no blockers. That's a worthless discussion. That's a meeting you should kill. They were supposed to be meetings to kill meetings. And I just want to zip through some of these kind of fundamental things before we kind of go beyond them, like this product owner idea. Not a bad idea in its essence. It's been bugging me for a long time because I hear a lot of this, well, we're not doing well in this iteration or sprint because the stories weren't written by the product owner well. And it's like, you know what? 1994 just called up and the requirements weren't clear enough. It's the same. It's just a new wall. You're just giving it new names. You're still throwing people under buses and over walls. And the product owner idea was very different than what it's evolved into. It was, you guys are a team, and I give you direction, and you have ownership, and you're not just zombies that consume stories and pump them out of sprints. It was to try and have people take ownership and be what I've been thinking of as product developers. It doesn't always turn into that these days. It oftentimes turns into more zombies, more people just doing what they're told. This is a really good, this paper, has anybody seen this paper in here? It's called One Team. It was written, I think a year or two after extreme programming came out by one of the guys that propagated it, who was kind of saying, stupid mistake is the header of it. And when you read this area that I highlighted, don't get me wrong, if you can find one person that knows the whole domain, is willing to make quick decisions and fix them later, can speak to both concretely, abstractly, can put up with a room full of nerds, you're likely to be successful. Those are rare. In fact, one of the things that's interesting being at Disney is that when Disney bought Pixar, the Disney executives went to Pixar and they said, how do you guys find the people with the brilliant ideas? And the Pixar leadership said, that's not how we work. We come up with an idea and we surround it with 250 people that are all part of making that movie. And we try and get all 250 people to put ideas in. And then the language Pixar uses is there's a group that synthesizes it into a cohesive whole. That's another way to think about why Pixar products are so good. And that synthesizing is not simple. It's not something that's as concrete as test-driven. It's where the tell that people get into when they don't do that well is someone who really cares on the programming space is holding the story and says, I don't see why we're doing this. I don't see the big picture. The big picture is missing. That metaphor is really strong. That says context is lacking. A lot of these metaphors, sprinting, velocity. It's funny how many people use velocity and they don't understand the origin of it. My email signature says, if you don't know where you're going, it's easy to iteratively not get there. Velocity is more than just speed. It's direction. It's vector. You're supposed to be going somewhere. It was a much richer concept than a lot of what it's turned into. This is one of my favorite pictures, so I don't want these to all be negative stories. These guys have figured out that the goal is to not track how much you necessarily get done, but be able to quickly see kind of what you're learning from the past. So you can see there's not a lot of numbers, there's not a lot of noise in their stories. These guys have, I'll show you their story map later with a Kanban wall next to it. And this is how they track things. They just stick them on top of these spigots. Because one of the shifts that I want to talk about in a few minutes is for years and years we've been saying, how big is it? In fact, I think one of the problems is the only question we've given most leadership people to ask is, when will it be done? Or how big is it? And we need to kind of change some of that language by saying, this is what is done, this is what is left. And I know that seems trivial, but I see a lot of leadership groups that are still saying, when is it going to be done? When these items become all about the same size, then you have a discussion vehicle. that goes beyond just a process, because when everything's a 5, then it's pretty stupid to get together and say, is that still a 5? Yep, is that still a 5? Is that still a 5? And this joke popped up. I was just talking to James because he came up with planning poker as a pragmatic way to probably help make people make decisions. You can speak to kind of what it was later. But people that I think are using this tool well, they use it for a while and it's kind of like training wheels, and they throw it out because they figured out the goal is to not talk about whether it's a 2 or a 40. The goal is to try and get everything to be about the same size, because when that happens, then flow happens. It's just kind of a different way of coming at generating flow, XP versus lean concepts or something like that. The people that are struggling in their honeymoon period are arguing about whether it's a 5 or an 8. And I say, what if we call it a 7? They say, we don't have a 7 card. And now we're practicing the let's be idiots process, That's crazy behavior. What really kills me about some of these people is they use all this language, they sit down, they go through this planning poker ceremony, and they still have no idea whether they're going to be able to accomplish anything, what they're going to be able to accomplish. Even close, it's just an exercise in empty ritual. As opposed to this, I think, is a fairly decent tool when used effectively. I wish it were just called visualization. I might get in trouble here because I know there's a lot of lean movements, but I've gone into companies and they said, oh yeah, we're using Kanban. I'm like, why are you using Kanban? Oh, Scrum didn't work. Well, why didn't Scrum work? I'm trying to kind of understand. Well, everybody hated the meetings. Well, what was wrong with the meetings? Well, people didn't get along, so you're using Kanban. And what they have is visual waterfall. They still don't talk to each other. They still don't collaborate. Things move through here, and there's not much more than a visualization. If that's helpful, that's fine. If you're using this, it's fine. If you're using it, I would say try this. Try and add this last column over here, which is, so what that you got things done? Getting things done is like celebrating that you're the FedEx guy. So now you finally show up on time and stuff in the box isn't broken. The FedEx dude then splits like, yep, good luck, hope you don't have buyer's remorse. Right? We got to go past that and say, was it valuable? This raises the bar pretty high, and it's going to challenge your constraints of how quickly you can learn whether you've actually really delivered value. And when I mean valuable, I don't mean someone was happy in a demo after 2 weeks. I mean some kind of concrete measure of value, more users, more units, something, more lives saved, something that's significant. I mean, that little line right there raises the bar. That's a very simple process change you can make. It's hard to say that in the honeymoon window, continuous integration isn't good. Continuous testing isn't good. And yet there's still all sorts of companies that say, we can't do that. We can't do that. It's not possible. It's rarely impossible. It's oftentimes difficult. I heard someone say one time, most things are not impossible. Some things are very expensive. So then you switch the language to be it's an investment. And then you have to figure out whether you can do it. If you're doing a medical device, you don't run away from this stuff. All the places I work where people are held accountable around saving lives have high visibility into quality more often, very often. Okay, so that's up to the honeymoon window. But a lot of you guys are in that space, have gone through that space. So let's talk about kind of beyond that. Here's some of the things I think don't get named. People spend their time talking about process language because they're learning. And when you're learning music, you have to understand key signatures, you have to understand how to read the music, but your goal is to not show up at a performance and play scales. If you're playing scales for an audience and they're excited, you should question the audience. Right? Your goal is to play music, and your goal is to not just get through the song, it's to do something meaningful. So I want to show you some of the shifts that I think have happened that don't get enough visibility. One of which is, we used to talk about what's required. And it's pretty funny, for years and years, we went through creating requirements, and then we sit around and talk about what's required. You have to appreciate the humor of that if you don't understand the industry at all. And I think the shift, where helpful, is people are shifting not from what's required or what's requested to what's needed. That's deep product thinking that's very hard. Most people will tell you what they want, not what they need. The more scared they are, the more they tell you what they want instead of what they need. It takes a little bit of work, like maybe an anthropologist or a counselor, to try and get people relaxed so you can start understanding what their needs are. Rarely you'll find someone like Kent Beck was talking about that can do that. How much does it cost versus how much opportunity? So many times at companies, what I see happening is there's latent constraints that are introduced because people are so concerned that we're not going to get it done, that mostly what they care about is the cost. And once you start delivering consistently, then you can shift the dialogue from what is the cost and when it will be done to how valuable was it. The shorter that cycle time is, the more often you could have that discussion. That's really hard with a pacemaker. That's why a 6-week window for firmware, software, verification testing is astounding in that space, because they can learn very, very fast because they have brutal constraints, maybe like you guys do in many ways. This is one of the things I was talking about, from how big to too big. Another one that I hear, like metaphors that we live and tragically die by, is we have to get better at estimating. We're not very good at estimating. We have to get better at estimating. It's like, if you're estimating what you don't understand, getting better at that is a fool's folly. Right? You need to shift from learning to estimate to learning from estimates. So here's something that kind of is shocking to me, is you get a group of people working well together. You're giving them work. Part of learning from estimates is figuring out who has what skills, what are your constraints, which ones can you chip away at, how much volatility is in the system. And if that group stabilizes, and you throw something new at them, and the estimates don't go kind of erratic, then you have a bunch of people that are cooking the books. Because the numbers should go haywire if you throw new things at them. That's the nature of doing new things. And yet, when the numbers go haywire, people often say, ooh, see, that's not a very good team. Instead of saying, that's a really good team. That's what I mean by learning to estimate. We have all these funky cards at DevJam that say things like, learning from estimates instead of learning to estimates. We have another one that says Fred Brooks was right. Because all sorts of people, and they look at a burn-up chart and the line's going like this and it's not going as steep as they want to, and they say, well, look, if we just add 5 more people. I hear that all the time, and I'm like, wow, we still haven't learned. Now we've just produced evidence that's more mythical faster. The last one, and I broke these down kind of into products, planning, and technology. The last one, you could say, if I summed up those things that I care about, we went from lying about testing to doing it first. And here's what I mean by that. So here's beyond the honeymoon thing. I think this is a really cool tool that's out there that a lot of people don't draw on. So this is quantity, and this is time. And assume you have continuous integration. So you're working away, and if you're using some kind of a metric and you're saying, we're trying to drive towards getting to here, getting to this point at this point in time, and we're working along, and things aren't going well, and they're not really going well, and suddenly they start going really well. So this represents quantity of what you're getting done. But there's a hidden line, which is maybe you were making investments in testing, and then you just bagged those investments in testing. So now you have a quality measure. This is not new. This is a visualization of things Deming said a very long time ago. It's just we have the ability to kind of do a mashup of these two now. The delta between these two is affectionately called regression deficit. And this is not a new concept. It just gets propagated when all people focus on is getting more done in Sprint 26. We have more velocity, and they throw out any measure of quality. What is the Deming quote? You can't measure quantity without quality. Does anybody know that quote? This is an old quote dude said a very long time ago. This is data that everybody has. So if you have tests running in continuous integration, you have this data point. If you're tracking progress in some way, you have this data point. Bang, you can create these. Creating these little mashups at companies all over the place. And they come inside organizations that are getting good at delivery. So I've been thinking a lot like a bad physicist, or I always think of my high school physics teacher saying, assume acceleration is a constant, because there's a bunch of other problems we need to talk about. So assume, for a second, delivery is a constant. I'm not saying it doesn't have some variance, but just say you trust things are going to get done. So you have all this stuff down here that is often called agile. Then your challenge becomes, are you building the right thing? And that's a lot harder to measure. That's the same thing like that value column in the Kanban board. And then you start asking all sorts of other questions. And I would imagine that these lean startup dudes, in fact, I know for a fact, I was in a webinar once that Eric Ries was doing, and Kent Beck was in the webinar, and Eric Ries typed back to Kent Beck, "Hey, I see there's someone in the webinar named Kent Beck. Is that really Kent Beck?" And Kent typed yes. The simplest thing that could possibly work. And it was really interesting. Eric kind of went on to say, a bunch of us have been extreme programmers for a very long time, and I think what he meant is they had a lot of discipline engineering. They had solved a lot of the delivery problems, and they realized now it's a matter of, are we delivering the same thing? We have to go past being the FedEx dude. Another way to look at that, I think it's an interesting picture to draw, is, again, this is time. So old school, we had this idea of we would do analysis, design, implement, and test, and out here is where the money lied. And you started working away, and the larger the amount of time was, the more likely the money, the opportunity was going to move. And the rub is that if this is all you've done and you haven't started building anything, you get to start over redefining what that is. So what I think people have not necessarily talked about in the Agile space very well is there's still a discovery window, ideation, raw product thinking. Then from that window on, you start putting in points in time because you say, this is where we think the money is. But when the money moves, the real measure of Agile in my mind is how easy is it for you to go where you need to. Whatever is under this, in this area right here is what I'm curious about. So let me give you some context from kind of down the street. At the Autodesk group in Lake Oswego, Lake, what is it? Is that the right name? Yeah, I got all my lakes mixed up. 10,000 lakes guy. We put an interesting rule in place. The design group came to me and said, I hate this Agile stuff. Someone went into their world and gave them the Scrum. I get a lot of phone calls from big companies right now. Can you teach us the Scrum? Oh, no. Someone went in, very team-focused. You're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and this is Scrum, and if you don't do that, you're a Scrum butt, and all this kind of language like this. And they got a bunch of teams going and working inside a tool that only showed how my team is doing. And it was very team-focused. The problem is the product they produce cuts across the teams. One team is not significant in their world. And the people that figure that out, in this case, are what they call the learning experience people, the people that are writing the manuals, the people that are doing the testing, the people that have to cut across all these things say it doesn't fit together. The design group very much hated the way they were taught Scrum because someone said, you write all the stories in Sprint 0. That is so arbitrary from a product perspective. In these 2 weeks, we'll design our product and then we'll start building it. Why? Because that's Agile? Or because that's a good idea? I mean, the nature of a product might mean that you need more than 2 weeks. Waiting to get started building, I think, is still problematic, but prescribing product ideation in a 2-week window is following the process instead of learning from it. So what we did at Autodesk, that I asked if I could tell this story, is we put in a little guide, no more than 10% of time in ideation. And that was interesting because one of the problems we were solving is they have someone making a request saying, what's going to be in the big conference at the end of the year? And so that was one of the conundrums they had that went way beyond the honeymoon that violates a lot of the Agile language. It's a question that will continue to be asked until it's answered, and then it will be asked again. And so we did this kind of some of these tools that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, where we kind of created these little things called concepts, which was a little bit of a persona, a small slice of a story map or a scenario, and some kind of visual design around that. And the design group started working upstream in an iterative fashion, saying, look, we only have 10%. But 10% was more investment thinking than process thinking, and I really like that language. No more than 10% was the specific language. It didn't say, you have a month to just kind of wait and stall and then get it all done the last few days. Because then they can start saying, okay, well, when we're building things, we're actually, at this point, we're 100% done with 10%. Because at this point, you're 50% done with 100%. And that's a big game changer right there. That alone, that's what I'm trying to accomplish with using Agile methods, is not adherence to process, but trying to get whole things done that we can validate sooner. It turns out a lot of the mechanics that are out there work pretty well for that. So if we build on that and we go beyond my team and your team. In fact, one of my friends runs the front end for Gmail right now. And he just wrote a blog called I Fear Self-Organization. And he's someone that I know really gets this stuff. Because in his world, any one team is rarely autonomous to the others. So as the person that's looking at the outcomes, if this person's estimating in earwigs, and this person's estimating in bananas, and this person's estimating in oranges, the only way he can draw any kind of conclusions is if he understands the average size between the average earwig, banana, and orange. And this is the same thing I encountered working with Siemens Medical in Philadelphia. The executive leadership sat down with me, which is shocking, because I call my look business camping. So if you don't sell it at REI, I don't buy it, right? And so I'm sitting with these leadership at Siemens. It's a pretty traditional organization. They're like, we like this Scrum stuff. It's really working for us. Although sometimes we give a story, we want this thing done, and it gets fed into 6 teams, and no one can tell me how are we doing on this thing. All they can tell me about how teams are doing. And I think that's one of the things we need, one of the beyond the honeymoon things we need to start chipping away at. So I gave you an example. Affectionately called the story map. It's just a tool. Right? Don't get too wild about it. It's not a religion. It's not heavy science. It's just a tool. There was a bunch of us that started doing this, visualizing user experiences or customer journeys. A guy named Jeff Patton started calling these things story maps. I like that metaphor because a map kind of connotates that you have to choose a route through it. This is a map that was done by a group of people that watched Jeff and I do a story mapping session at the University of Minnesota in a thing called Code Freeze that we have every year in the middle of January because it's so horrible in Minnesota in January. Someone watched us do this and then went away and did it. You don't have to go to a certification class. It's a very simple process which starts with some definition of who. Who's your design target? Who are you going after? What are their needs? Sometimes I'll say needs. Some people will say activities. Some people might use goals. Goals and needs are higher order thinking than activity and tasks, but she is trying to accomplish this. And then I'll sit with people and say, okay, well, let's come up with some examples. Let's come up with a very simple example. A simple example is a great place to start telling someone's user experience. The problem with simple examples is there's always these dudes in the room that I call the whatabouts. And you want to talk about the simple example, and the whatabouts say, what about, right? And whatabouts are good people to have around because they're thinking about all the edge cases. But the problem with the whatabout dudes is they will take you down to the bottom of the ocean when you're trying to charter a course forward because that's where all the cool shells are. And so I kind of take the whatabout dudes and I say, give me your most complex example. Bring it on. Let's talk about the one that scares everyone. And like right there in one simple question, I see how much courage is in the room. Because agile schmagile, man, there has to be a measurable amount of courage to do product development because part of product development is failing. If you can drive the cost of failure down, then you're less fearful of it, or you have to have some chutzpah to do it. The complex example helps the whatabouts calm down. And then we start walking a day in the life. She's trying to do this, and we kind of build this first set of maps, this first slice through. Might not look as pretty as that. For people that are using stories, all of these things are stories. These are stories. This is the story that was promoted out of those. People are trying to do the same thing. They're doing it different ways. So like to give you context jumping forward, when we go to estimate, we estimate these, but not this, because this is decomposed into those. In this little simple design, this map I have here, this is a technique I use. That's a system-initiated event, an asynchronous activity for geeks in the room. These are user-centered, these are system-centered, because there are many things I work on where there is no user, or we just built this railroad transportation system for Siemens. We're on the 3rd go of working with Siemens, so it's a transportation group that's working on products in North America, and we're collaborating with the kind of mothership in Germany. In that group, this is Team A. This is Team A over here, and this is Team B. Team A is a heavy user-centered solution. Team B is a rules engine. And so now we're driving out what the API should be into the rules engine based on the use in context to telling the story of the product. And that feels like suddenly we have all these tools that start adding the context that goes beyond, I gave this story to this team in this sprint. If you get to work in that world, stop and have a little moment of celebration. Yay! And there was much rejoicing. If you got to work in a multi-team environment where the people that are paying for it don't really care about how each team is doing, because that's just an arbitrary decomposition in order to produce the product. You need to be able to answer the product questions. This is a tool that I use that starts helping me do that. So assuming product is defined in a way that you can decompose it and recompose it across teams, that's something more than an epic. So this is more user-centered than what many people are doing in the Agile space, which is they write a bunch of big epics and they break them down into small things. And then those poor testing and learning experience people at the end have to figure out how to recompose it into a product like the users do. So we use really simple techniques. This isn't a lot of rocket science. This is something that in 2002, I started seeing everybody that was doing multi-team, larger scale delivery, doing like Medtronic. I was doing this stuff at Travelocity and Best Buy and places like that, is we do a little planning session that's cross-cutting. So here's a typical team planning session. This is team A. We'll just kind of draw a really simple picture, B and N over here. Typically, team gets together, they do some planning, they kind of maybe do some estimates, maybe they don't, maybe that's a pull model, but they're trying to figure out kind of what is the next chunk we want to get done, whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban. Product thinking is thinking about holistic things, not just units of flow. What we do in cross-team planning is this is kind of where the cross-cutting thinking happens up here. So we'll have someone that's thinking about architecture, someone that's thinking about UX, someone that's maybe a product manager. And then there's kind of a crossover space. So there's two people on this team, someone that's thinking about product and someone that's thinking about technology that might be doing more listening here, that bring that information back into this group. It's a really simple model. This is what we did at Reuters for a project that has 10 to 15 teams. It's probably more than that now. And then we just figured out how to put the right group together. This is exactly what we did at Siemens. The Siemens projects have 18 teams of 10 to 12. This works. This isn't just my crazy behavior. And this is about what are the cross-cutting goals? So maybe Team B, most of what they're doing, everybody else is dependent on. That's a really important thing to surface. The estimates are not as important as understanding the constraints in delivering a product across teams. Team A has very little cross-cutting, so most of their planning can just be their own. They can do their own thing. They can work independently. And then you get back together at the end and you say, okay, what are the constraints? To give you guys the context around this might be 60 minutes. This is determined by each team. This might be 60 minutes. So for a lot of the big projects that we're doing where we're trying to set up a program-level cadence to produce product across team, in 2 hours in a 2 to 3 week window, we get understanding of constraints and dependencies and complexities cross-team. That's a good investment. I don't know if there's an Agile book about this because I still think there's too many people out there that are just greenfielding websites in Rails. But this is the reality of this is what I was just doing at Disney before I came here. And it doesn't mean just because you have this process, it works well. It solves your problem, I should say. It's difficult. There's a lot of brutal systemic constraints. These are some of the people that are typically outside of that group. They're not on one of these teams. Hopefully more of these people are on teams. I'm not sure if this group will be on teams. I'm not sure about this, but in the AutoCAD example that I was telling you, there was this raw product thinking. Over here is the big trade show they go to. This was 10%. And then we took kind of early learning and we said, at this point, we'll give some kind of a plus or minus of what's going to be in that trade show. Now, it's still plus or minus, but it drives people in larger complex systems to think about early delivery is more about learning instead of kind of the simplistic mantras of every sprint will produce potentially shippable product. Right? That's a nice idea or ideal, but it's contextually insignificant in many large organizations where you have multiple systems that have all their own set of constraints and you're trying to piece them together. And what you're trying to do is figure out what Nassim Taleb says in The Black Swan, what you don't know. It's what you don't know that hurts you later. So those early iterations become as much about learning as they are about delivery. Now, if you're only doing modeling, obviously you're not learning much. But if you're worried about you don't have consistent velocity, because you're going through all sorts of gyrations trying to smoke out the dependencies and constraints, you should be celebrating that you're learning instead of worrying that you don't have consistent velocity. It's just you're chasing kind of the wrong goal at that point. This is an example right here. So if any of you guys are Disney fans, this is called the Disney Magical Express. So if you go there, get off the plane in the airport, you pretty much just get handled all the way to your room. There's 26 systems that they have to put together to do this. This is very common in gigs I work on. 26 is a little bit outrageous. Some of the systems are horrible. And these people would tell you some of the systems are horrible. I was blown away that these guys so much like these maps. So you can see these maps aren't single user experiences. These are huge systemic things. Don't think just because there's a couple Post-its back there that that's 3 or 4 days of work. We're not even in that space yet. We're trying to think of product and user experience. We're trying to visualize product and user experience across systems and teams, because that is what they have to do in the end. It doesn't matter how any one team does. And this is, if you knew the people in this room, it was that cross sections. There's some people that sit across groups, architecture, product management, and then there's some pairs from each one of those teams that are trying to say, where does my piece fit into this larger puzzle? Same kind of thing here. This happens to be where these have multiple systems. This is a website. This is Reuters, west.thomson.com. They have some distributed players. These are personas. These are from the what about dude who wouldn't calm down. He just what abouted us, and it's like we kept writing him, and I thought, this dude's never going to calm down, so I'm just going to have to ask him to be quiet for a little bit. But we're thinking here, I asked the person that's in charge of this project, just roughly how big do you think is it? He said this is probably 6 to 9 months for 12 to 15 people. So it's not trivial, but we're not estimating it. We're just thinking kind of about the product. The numbers are floating in the background. This is a very large effort at Reuters. This was like their #1 product delivery in 2010 for the company. At the same time, while they had some very large things go down, if you walked in and you watched what we were doing here, you wouldn't go, he's reinvented Agile. We've just said, what are the actual challenges? How do we use the tools to address the challenge of greenfielding a very large legal system? And I kind of want to bring it in with some weirder examples, because I put this one in here thinking of you guys. This is a company called Douglas Scientific. They build instruments that produce assays. So at the table here is 3 mechanical engineers, 2 software engineers, and an electrical engineer. Here's their story map. These are all the user stories. These are all the things that the instrument does that the user doesn't know about. And so they're trying to break it down. Their planning session was brilliant. Now, they're lucky because the mechanical guys have a fabrication shop across the street. One of the mechanical guys on the team is going to do some of the fabrications, but one of my favorite part of the planning session is someone said, what do you think the test is for that story? The mechanical guy said, I think it should be about this big. I was like, that's so excellent, because they have an unsolvable problem. They're trying to build a brand new product for the company in 9 months. No one thinks it's possible. Everybody's scared. Many people are in paralysis of like, well, we really need to understand it if we're going to do that in 9 months. But this group is brave enough to say, let's do something that's iterative. And so the electrical guy is struggling a little bit because he wants the stepper motor to move very slow. And the mechanical dude is like, what if we just pushed a button and it just moved across? I mean, it was a really neat, they call them instruments, but a product-based discussion. And I think, again, story maps aren't magic, but they provide the context so people aren't thinking individualistically. They're coming together to think about a product. Same kind of thing here. These guys have actually, their map is over here. So we left their map whole, and they're breaking it down and doing product planning. I just put this in here because I always hear people say, you keep showing us all these Post-its. We can't do this with other people. These guys are doing remote planning with commodity tools that they bought at the Best Buy down the street. I love this picture, dude, because dude's head is just about the same size as everyone else's. I mean, if you were in there, you wouldn't even known. And I also work at places that have really beautiful systems, but these guys put this together for almost nothing, and it was really about them thinking about the ergonomics of the room. We do a lot of distributed stuff, so maybe this is something that I could show you guys in the open space, is we're so much interested in this mapping thing and how it brings people together, but there are a lot of groups where some physical medium isn't possible at all, many. So what cardboard is it gives you kind of like a collaborative environment with cards where multiple people can move them around at the same time, and you can build these large maps, and then you can cut a slice through that map, which is kind of the last thing I want to show you. I want to kind of talk about slicing products, because I'm super excited about this. So here's what a slice is. This is one of the products I worked on a lot in the last 2 years. Anybody know what Club Penguin is? Yeah, so like largest kids active environment in the world, classic million concurrent users, spikes to maybe 10 million concurrent users. You're a penguin, you go to this island, you get an avatar, you can bling out an igloo, you can invite your buddies to the igloo, you can go do things on the island. But what they didn't figure out, this is the kind of thing that users do in an online system, is the kids decided to just gather in mass and have a parade around the island. That's a really hard problem to solve from almost every dimension. It's a massive concurrency problem. It's a very difficult redraw problem on all the different devices, because the kids are going to play on whatever device they get their hands on. And they are going to just hammer the devices. One of the architects was like smoke and mirrors dude. Said yes, yes around Agile all the time and never really did it, so was always kind of like bringing in his PowerPoints without a PowerPoint compiler. So in the demo one time, we kind of sat dude down, and we had 2 machines set up with 2 monitors, and he came in and we said, well, just sit down over there for a second. We brought 2 kids in to play the game, because that's when a product is done. And the kids sat down in front of it. Kids don't have much governor. So when they're playing the game and they don't like it, they say, this game is stupid. That's what I mean by value delivered, right? I sit with a lot of business people that I think would like to say, this sprint is stupid. Because someone gets up and says, we got this done, we got this done, we got this done. They're just showing units completed instead of thinking about like slices. So a slice would look like this. This guy has actually worked at Pixar. So this guy is Scrum Master, this guy is Product Owner and traditional Agile lingo. This is kind of the view of their little world. This is a game called Karjitsu. These are different shots, kind of like storyboards, which this guy gets story mapping right away. A slice is, here's an example. And it goes like this through the system. The kid wants to do that, and then they're happy. Or then you can feel it. So it's a slice through that story map. It seems to be a great tool for bringing people together. That slice through that story map is also called the test case. It's also part of what you would write in a user manual. It connects, it's the context that I think is missing when we break things down to only getting stories done. This is a little group of Dev Jam guys, and this is after they sliced up something. So there was a whole map there, and they just took everything away and they started sketching and drawing around the outside of the slice. So their goal right now is not, what do we get done in sprint 5? And if you actually look, they're using very much like a Kanban process on the other side, but they leave the map hole and they start drawing slices through this map. That's their fundamental thing they're trying to get done. And the last thing I want to leave you with is what that looks like when people have never done it before. So this is at EMC in Silicon Valley, and they're really worried at EMC. The testers and the developers don't work together. They're run by different groups. They don't know how to do this stuff. So we went through a very simple exercise, not unlike what I'm going to do tomorrow, and we sat down. So this is, you can see there's one of these in the background. Here's someone we're trying to deliver value to, a design target. Here's some examples. Here's that map. We took a slice through that map, and it looks like this. So now you have the designer guy, the UX dude, a developer, a tech lead, a tester. A developer thinks the most important thing to do is code. Later, when we get rid of his code, he's going to call it a refactoring, which is a euphemism. It's just called wrong, dude. Could be called garbage, definitely called waste. But he's going to do it anyways, right? And so we sit down, and at first, the UX guy has the most stories to tell. He starts framing the context. He has probably, in this case, he has done the most research in the industry. He starts telling the story, and eventually, because it's easy, think about what's the barrier of entry from people being involved in framing the user experience. That's something for us to all think about. Tech lead takes over, tester takes over, And the UX dude gets frustrated and starts drawing sketches. So that's fantastic. So like in some of the simple dumbing down UX language, this is interaction design. This guy just added visual design, and the tester starts adding tests. And the system, the slice starts growing. So now their dimension is not which stories are we going to pull in to our Kanban wall, or which stories are we going to pull into this sprint. Everybody's gathered around getting a whole slice done that's valuable, and then you can actually put it in front of someone, and that's what it looks like. And the sketches are really cool because they're not static wireframes. The sketches are like animations that augment the storytelling process that's captured in the stories. That's why I'm so excited about this. And I see people doing it with simple things like paper. I see people doing this in tools. I see people doing a little bit of kind of the design thinking, the visual design thinking up front and bringing things in, like in this Disney example back here. These were screen snaps from the existing game. Typically what they do is they bring in screen snaps and someone draws right on them, because they have the constraints of art, rigor, design, programmers whose skills don't overlap. You don't ask the programmer to do the art. And you don't ask the artist to do the programming because they've both spent their 10,000 hours trying to get that done. And I wanted to kind of end with this because it's just a tool, right? Story mapping is not going to save the day, but I think it's going to start changing the dialogue that we need to have. If you guys are jazzed about this stuff, like I said, I wrote that book and I kind of bailed on it, so I turned it into like a video series, and I tried to have them be something that you could watch over lunch without it upsetting your stomach. So they're like little hour-long things that talk about how to help people introduce process in a pragmatic way, how to do product thinking, and I tried to reframe planning into learning. And I think that probably takes me to where I'm supposed to be stopping, and I'll leave you with Dude's Law. Go forth and challenge people. If they start telling you how, feel free to ask them why. Thanks very much for listening.